he was only 9 years old when the Prophet died. Right? Ibn Omar was only about 22, 23 years old when the Prophet died. They hadn't spent much of their adult life around the Prophet. Yet Abu Hurairah, Ibn Omar, Ibn Abbas, these are some of the biggest transmitters of hadiths from the Prophet. And the reason why I think is that they're like, sometimes when you get older and you start thinking about your grandparents, and maybe you only knew your grandparents for a few years, you start getting really curious about what they said and what their life was about, and you start collecting things that they left behind. Maybe your parents don't really care about that so much, because your parents, they remember their parents from when they were alive for over decades of their lives. Whereas the younger generation kind of goes back and starts trying to scavenge and find all those traces of that figure who's now gone. From the Sahifa stage, we find in the early Islamic period, around the 100 years after the death of the Prophet, the development of something called musannafs. A musannaf is a collection of reports that is topically arranged. And a musannaf is basically a transcript of the early stages of Islamic law and theology. So, imagine someone like Al-Hasan al-Basri. He died 110 of the Hijri calendar, 728 of the Miladi calendar. And he's sitting in Basra. Now, Hasan al-Basri's mother was one of the maids of one of the wives of the Prophet. Al-Hasan al-Basri grew up in Medina for a long time. He met and was able to study with people like Ali ibn Abi Talib. And then he moved to Basra later on in his life. So, where he became a leading religious figure, people turned to him because he was knowledgeable, because he was pious. And you can imagine him, he's sitting there, let's say he's sitting under a reed awning, he's just minding his own business, and people are coming up to him every day. Oh, Al-Hasan al-Basri, how should I pray? Oh, Al-Hasan al-Basri, my wife tells me that I'm not spending enough money on her. How much money do I have to spend on her? Oh, Al-Hasan al-Basri, my son's not listening to me. I don't know how I should handle this situation. Oh, Al-Hasan al-Basri, there's this new drink I saw. It's made from this fruit. I've never seen it before. Am I allowed to drink it or not? Right? And he's trying to answer these questions. He's thinking about the Quran. He's thinking about things that he heard from the Prophet, from his mother maybe, things that he learned from Ali ibn Abi Talib, different ways of solving problems. And he's drawing on all these sources in his mind to answer these questions. A musannaf is basically that kind of reasoning laid out in a book form. So you open a musannaf, for example, a very famous musannaf is the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas. Malik ibn Anas died 179 of the Hijri calendar, 796 of the Common Era. He lived in Medina. So he studied with successors, people who studied with the companions, people like Az-Zuhri. He studied with major scholars in Medina. Right? He saw the way the people in Medina were acting, how they were praying, how they carried on the sunnah of the Prophet. And in his Muwatta, you have about 1720 reports. Only 527 of them are actually hadiths. So only 527 of them actually go back to the Prophet, where the Prophet says, do this, don't do this, right? The rest of them are reports from companions, like Omar ibn al-Khattab. Omar ibn al-Khattab saying, I think the ruling for divorce is this. Or Abu Bakr saying, I think the right way to divide up inheritance is this. And many of them come from earlier scholars in Medina. People like Ibn Hurmuz, people like Rabi' al-Ra'i, people like Az-Zuhri, people like Urwa ibn az-Zubayr. Also Malik's own opinions. Malik says, well, I think the right way to pray is this. Or I think the right time to pray Maghrib is this time. So, just like I talked about earlier, that someone like Al-Hasan al-Basri is going to be drawing on all these varied sources as he tries to answer questions to people when they come to him asking, how do I live as a Muslim? What's the way to live that's going to please God? Right? He draws on all these things, so the musannafs draw on these different sources. It's interesting because if you think about the musannafs, they're not really hadith collections. They have hadiths in them, but most of the stuff is actually from companions and successors. Now, you can ask a question, wait a second, I thought Islam was about following the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Why does it matter what Omar ibn al-Khattab said? Or why does it matter what Malik said? It's important to remember that in this early period, the hadith tradition is very localized. What does that mean? Malik lived in Medina his whole life. He only ever went to Hajj. He went to Mecca for Hajj. He never left Medina. Other companions of the Prophet moved over to Kufa, like Ibn Mas'ud, and lived in Kufa. So what happened is different companions took their different recollections of the Prophet's Sunnah to different cities. And they didn't really mix until later on, until the 800s of the Common Era, the time of people like Ibn Hanbal. So Malik might answer a question based on, let's say, what Omar's opinion was, or what his own opinion was. And there might be a hadith in Kufa, or in Syria, or in Egypt, he just doesn't know about. That's why he doesn't give a hadith. And many of the answers that he uses to write the book, his Muwatta, actually don't come from the Prophet, because at that time the hadith tradition was very localized and people just didn't have access to material that was in other regions. What happened in the next generation after people like Malik ibn Anas in the end of the 700s, the early 800s of the Common Era, is that people started traveling between the different cities. People from Basra would go to Iraq and go to Iran and go to Egypt and go to Yemen and start collecting all the different hadiths together. Now, imagine if you're somebody, let's say, what's a good example? A scholar named Abu Dawood al-Tayalisi, who died in 820 of the Common Era. So he's originally from near Isfahan, right? And he traveled in Iran. He travels all around to Egypt, to Yemen, to Mecca and Medina, to Syria. And he's collecting hadiths. How do you organize these hadiths? How do you just put them together? How do you begin to start figuring out what's reliable and what's unreliable by looking at the isnad? Well, you organize it by the isnad. So the musannafs were organized topically. So I want to know how to pray. So I open the book to the first chapter, which is on, or the second chapter probably, which is on prayer. And I look at the different sub-chapters and I say, okay, this is how the author thinks I should pray. These are how the different companions think I should pray. When the next generation isn't really concerned about these legal issues, they're just trying to collect all these different hadiths together and trying to figure out which ones are reliable and which ones aren't. So they organize it by isnad. This is what's the beginning of what's called the musnad collections, or hadiths collections that are organized by isnads. So the first chapter usually is, let's say, all the hadiths of Abu Bakr. The second chapter is all the hadiths narrated from Omar. Third chapter, all the hadiths narrated from Uthman, etc., etc., etc. Another feature of musnad collections is that by this time, Muslim scholars realized that if you're going to have a vision of Islamic